Sometimes we've had a long day. Many of us started hearings bright and early at 9 a.m. And thank you, Senator Harman and Senator Keogh and Senator DeSalle for joining us for this important discussion. Just a couple of opening comments on looking back in time. And Tom Martin and Senator Keogh, you were all here back in 2000 when we started on this journey, and relating first of all to determinations and findings that were being offered by organizations like Union Concerned Scientists and even Department of Water Resources on impacts of climate change to California, whether it's affecting our snowpack or sea level rise or the connection between a warmer climate and worse air quality conditions and impacts on public health, agricultural interests, and the list goes on and on. Those findings have been documented and are even more enhanced, especially as it relates to extreme weather events here in California. So we well know the cost of not doing anything, and California has tried to move forward in a very thoughtful manner in addressing this important issue, but also addressing issues such as national security and the economy, coming up with that win-win opportunity of having a healthy environment and a vibrant economy, creating jobs for this new 21st century global economy is incredibly important. So a brief recap, and then I'll introduce our first speaker. AB 32 was passed in 2006, and it had two primary parts to it. It had a reporting part requiring all the significant emitters who would report a baseline establishing how much greenhouse gas emissions they reduced. And the second part of AB 32 was simply to reduce it, the levels of greenhouse gas emissions back to 1990 by 2020. We charged the California Air Resources Board with the authority of implementing this. Also, language in the bill gave CARB, the California Air Resources Board, to authority to adopt. It said they may adopt market-based mechanisms, and the subject of our discussion is cap and trade, which is part of that definition. ARB has done an incredible job in meeting the timeline as set forth under AB 32 to come up with a program. Now, today we're talking about cap and trade. You may not know that cap and trade emissions in a program is slated for only 60% of the emissions reductions required under AB 32. Most of the emissions reductions are things that we've championed for 12 years, whether it's the clean car legislation or energy efficiency measures, or whether it's our renewable portfolio standard, where we had bipartisan support on the floor last year to increase to 33%. All of these are policies, as well as several others that I'm sure will be described more in depth by our first speaker, and that's Mary Nichols, chairperson of the California Air Resources Board. She's back for a return visit. Those of you who know, she was around during Governor Brown's first administration, and I can't think of anyone better with that kind of experience to go from Jerry Brown the first to current Jerry Brown under Arnold Schwarzenegger's administration, and she has worked amazingly well and productively with our federal sister agency, the EPA, in adopting national standards based on California's models. And so thank you very much, and you're going to give us an update on AB 32 and the cap and trade program.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair and members. As you noted, in recent years, California has made great strides down the path to a clean energy future. And this success is due to I think, an excellent collaboration and partnership between the legislature and a number of agencies, including the Air Resources Board. The legislature delivered a number of important policy advances, including AB 1493, which set the nation's first vehicle standards for greenhouse gas emissions, AB 118, which is helping to drive the development of cleaner fuels, Senate Bill 375, which is moving us towards more sustainable and livable communities, and of course Senate Bill 2X, which has driven major investment in Californians' abundant renewable energy resources, including wind and solar. And there are many, many more. These are the kinds of policies that have made California a global hub for investment in clean technology and that will deliver significant health and environmental benefits to all Californians for decades to come. And of course, that's the part of it that is where the Air Resources Board comes in. But probably around the world, the bill number that is most associated in people's minds with California's global leadership in the fight against climate change is AB 32. And just as a reminder, AB 32 required California to cut statewide emissions of greenhouse gases to 1990 levels by 2020. To achieve this goal, as you noted, we're using a suite of different programs that cut across virtually all sectors of the economy to accelerate innovation in cleaner and more advanced technologies, while at the same time continuing our progress towards meeting air quality standards. Earlier this year, we passed a package of regulations that are going to change the makeup of California's vehicle fleet over the next 15 years and pave the way for a zero-emission fleet by 2050. In the process, they will deliver significant public health benefits and save consumers billions of dollars at the pump. Just last Friday, the governor announced that $120 million in legal settlement funds owed to the people of California via the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, as a result of a settlement, is going to be dedicated to establishing thousands of public electric vehicle charging stations across the state. And other major elements of the state's plans include the now statutorily required 33% renewable electricity standard, SB 375, energy efficiency standards for buildings and appliances, as well as the low carbon fuel standard. But I'm here today to update you on the cap and trade program, which is a significant piece of our overall program to meet the very ambitious goals of AB 32. The cap and trade program is designed to allow California to harness the power of the market in order to make further progress towards our clean energy and environmental goals. The program works by establishing a hard cap on about 85% of the total statewide greenhouse gas emissions. ARB will issue allowances equal to the total amount of allowable emissions over the compliance period. One allowance equals 1 metric ton of greenhouse gases. Over time, as the cap declines, fewer allowances will be available, thus assuring that we will meet our AB 32 target. So, under this program, individual companies do not have specific reduction requirements. Rather, all companies that are covered by the regulation are required to turn in allowances in an amount that's equal to their total greenhouse gas emissions during each of the compliance phases. It's a 3-year average over the life of the program. By this means, the program gives companies the flexibility to trade allowances with others or to take steps internally within their own operations to reduce emissions at their own facilities by whatever means they find most cost effective. Companies that emit more will have to turn in more allowances. Companies that can cut their emissions will have to turn in fewer. But as the cap declines, total emissions from all the covered sectors must be reduced. In the first phase of the program, most of the allowances are going to be given away for free to all major sources like refineries, cement plants, as well as the electricity sector. And companies will also have the ability to purchase additional allowances that they may need due to growth or changes in their operations at regularly scheduled auctions. Starting in 2015, transportation fuel and residential commercial natural gas also come under the program. The program requires an economy-wide, or provides, an economy-wide price signal because an allowance is an allowance and can be used anywhere. So it gives value to carbon in a way that shows that we're serious about powering our economy with truly clean, advanced, and sustainable technologies. And it also makes it clear that investment in these technologies will be rewarded, again, by putting a price on the value of those allowances. As you know, when it comes to creating innovative new technologies, Californians are among the best in the world, and they deserve to be rewarded for their efforts. Well, where are we in this program? As I indicated when I was here last June, the first compliance period for the cap and trade program is for 2 years, beginning on January 1, 2013. What this means is that entities that are covered by the program will be responsible for reducing their emissions beginning next year. In anticipation of this, we've been working very hard to make sure all the pieces of the program are in place and fully operational. We've already implemented the first stage, which is to receive reports from all of the covered entities that document what their emissions actually are. And I'm happy to tell you that we are on track. However, as I've also said on a number of different occasions, we will only complete the launch of the program and start the auction process when we are entirely confident that every piece of it is fully developed and ready to go. This includes both the system for distributing the free allowances as well as the auction itself and the enforcement and market oversight elements of the program. Now, I want to turn to this critical issue of market oversight and enforcement because we have made this a critical element in the design of the program. There are really multiple elements that are in this program that are designed to deter and detect and to punish any type of market manipulation or fraudulent activity, including rigorous documentation, financial assurance requirements for anyone who chooses to participate in our program, a unified registry for allowance and offset tracking, and specified holding and purchase limits for allowances, all designed to make sure that we do not become a magnet for any kind of unscrupulous trading entities. We also recognize that the success of this program is contingent on a high level of stakeholder confidence in the system, and that's why we have a number of transparency elements in the program as well, including provisions for the regular release of public information about the market's operations, creation of an independent market surveillance committee, and retaining an independent market monitor whose job is to monitor each auction and be on constant lookout for any symptoms of irregularity. We have developed these components with extensive input from a number of leading economic, legal, and regulatory design experts. They will give us a set of tools to prevent and detect any irregularities and to take swift corrective action if necessary. Now, as I mentioned, even though we are initially providing most of the allowances for free, we will auction a portion of the allowances. The auction is an important mechanism to promote market transparency, and it also gives companies additional incentive to find ways to cost-effectively reduce their emissions. As laid out in the regulation, the state will hold regularly scheduled auctions on a quarterly basis that will give companies additional opportunity to acquire allowances they will need for purposes of compliance. Last year, when my board adopted the regulation, we planned to hold the first auction in August. However, given our commitment to getting the program smoothly launched from the start, we plan to revise this schedule to hold the first auction on November 14th of this year. This will not impact the timeline for the full program launch in January 2013, and it doesn't change the total number of allowances auctioned this year. So that we'll just pool all of the allowances into the to be auctioned into this November auction. And it also doesn't impact the timeline for full program launch in January 2013, as I said. Because companies don't need to turn in any allowances until November 2014, they will have ample time and opportunity to acquire any allowances they may need in addition to what they are given for free for compliance purposes. But holding this first auction in November will allow us to perform a number of important activities before then, including efforts to maximize readiness on the part of stakeholders and participants. In the next few months, we will be launching and testing both the allowance tracking system and the auction platform. This will allow us to work very closely with stakeholders to ensure that they are fully trained and familiar with both systems in advance of the first auction. We also plan to hold a fully simulated practice auction for stakeholders in August of this year. And we expect to have the results from market simulation exercises that we are undertaking that will provide additional valuable insight and information in advance of the first auction. Now, while our first priority has been and will remain to get this program running smoothly and effectively. We also, as a result of the auctioning, will have the opportunity to strategically invest funds from the auction of allowances in furtherance of the goals outlined in AB 32. Strategic investment of these funds can and should be another important tool that we can use to move California towards a low-carbon future in a way that protects California consumers and ratepayers. In addition to supporting efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions, a thoughtful and coordinated investment plan will deliver major economic, air quality, and public health benefits for Californians, including the most disadvantaged communities in our state. The governor's budget for fiscal year 12-13 lays out a framework for strategic investment in areas like clean and efficient energy, low-carbon transportation and infrastructure, and natural resource protection. The budget describes a number of important programs and policy goals that could be supported with auction funds. We've also been working closely with the Public Utilities Commission in their ongoing proceedings to ensure that the value of allowances in the electricity sector is used for ratepayer benefit while also maintaining the appropriate price signal for utilities to continue to move towards lower carbon alternatives. A number of stakeholder groups, expert advisory committees, and of course many of you in the legislature have already given careful and in some cases very detailed thought to the way that a strategic investment plan in carbon reduction could be crafted and implemented to maximize economic, environmental, and clean energy benefits for the state. To ensure that we are able to make the most informed and thoughtful investment decisions, we will be holding a public workshop soon to consider additional ideas, thoughts, and input on this topic, and we will be asking people to come and be prepared to address some specific questions about how their various proposals will work. This will support the state effort to develop an effective investment plan, enable us to quickly invest these funds after we know the precise amount of funding following the November auction. In light of the key role that you will play in this process, we very much look forward to your participation in this process as well. Finally, I want to turn to another important part of our effort to implement the Cap and Trade program, collaboration with our partners in the Western Climate Initiative. In AB 32, you gave the Air Resources Board specific direction to work with others, including other states and nations, to facilitate the development of integrated and cost-effective regional, national, and international greenhouse gas reduction programs. We have and continue to take that direction seriously. Over the past several years, we've worked closely with a number of other states and Canadian provinces in the Western Climate Initiative. Our work in the WCI has spanned a range of efforts and different types of programs. Work is currently underway on a proposal for consideration by our board in June of this year to link California's Cap and Trade program with Quebec. Like California, Quebec is hard at work on developing a rigorous and carefully designed cap and trade program. If the proposal is adopted, we would take the necessary steps to formally recognize allowances from Quebec into our program. With other of our Western Climate Initiative partners, including Quebec, we've also recently established the nonprofit entity WCI Inc. WCI Inc. will provide cost-effective administrative and technical support services for California and other WCI partners' cap and trade programs. It also allows us to maintain full regulatory authority and policy control over our state cap and trade program and all other aspects of AB 32. So it only exists for administrative support purposes. WCI Inc. also provides the opportunity to join forces with other like-minded entities in the effort to address climate change. In doing this, we can leverage a broader range of resources and expertise to develop a sophisticated program of infrastructure components, including the allowance tracking system, auction, and distribution operations, and market monitoring features, all of which will help make California's cap and trade program more successful. And of course, it also expands the base of allowances that are available that can be used to achieve the most cost-effective emissions reductions and create a greater market for low-carbon and clean technologies. As I've noted, we're now in the 6th year of our efforts to implement AB 32, and we've made actual progress, not just in adopting rules, but actually in reducing the amount of CO2 emissions based on what was called for under the program. We've made progress, but we continue to have a long way to go, and obviously the challenges that we are seeking to address have become ever more pressing. So this program is a vital element in achieving the next stage of what we hope will be an enduring program in California. And I think it shows once again that California is able and willing to lead the nation and the world in this effort. So I continue to look forward to working with you on this program, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair Nichols. Greatly appreciated. One thing I came away from on your written testimony that you submitted to each one of us, I noticed the change in the auction date. That's
Yes.
new information,
Yes,
is it
it
not?
is.
So August will be a practice run, if you
Correct.
will, and analyze how the assimilation.
Yes.
And November will be the real one.
It was important, I think, to get the word out to our partners as well as to the contractors who are working for us on the development of these specific tools for the auction, so everybody knows that in addition to the simulation exercises, which we've already planned, that we would have an opportunity for an actual pretend auction where people will get a chance to experience the real situation, but without the consequences that might come from an auction. We have every reason to believe that this is not going to be all that difficult, but it's just important that people feel comfortable with how it will work.
And so for some of the businesses who had some issues related to their particular concerns, that would give them a few additional months to
Yes,
collaborate and coordinate.
Yes, it does. There's obviously still some additional work to be done on the distribution of the free allowances as well, and those two things will go hand in hand.
Before Senator Keogh asks a question, maybe you could articulate for those watching by television. That's one reason we were late today. I wanted to wait for this room to be cleared so we can make sure it's televised and kept. If anyone wants to review the tapes, maybe you could articulate a little bit. Since this is just 16% of the emissions reductions envisioned in AB 32, why is it important to have a cap and trade component rather than just go a regulatory route? What are the benefits to the state or for the businesses in meeting their reduction targets by this market-based approach?
I think maybe the simplest way to say it is that with a cap and trade program, the value of the allowances will show people that there's real money to be made in cleaning up, and it will allow those with technologies that are looking to come here to be marketed or to be sold elsewhere, that they can show the actual value, and there will be real money at stake there, because companies will have a choice as to whether to buy allowances or to put on or purchase new technologies that will allow them not to have to buy allowances. So every company gets the choice as to how they want to meet their cap, meet their limit, but they will have the ability to do it knowing what the penalty will be, if you will, if they don't. So we've been told, and I think the history of the acid rain program, and also, although it certainly had some flaws in the beginning, the European system finally starting to send the signal to people that it's worth it to make investments in these clean technologies. So, it's not enough to have a better mousetrap if nobody can afford to buy your mousetrap. And in some situations, we have government subsidizing new technologies until they can become competitive. But we don't live in an era where we can subsidize everything, and nor would we want to. We want to provide capital from the private sector to go into these programs. So what has been shown, I think, quite convincingly, and certainly has good theory, but it also has some real-world practice behind it, is that when companies see that there's a monetary price, they build it into their planning, and they make the decision at the top level of the company whether they want to invest in more energy efficiency or in new technologies that are out there, or if they want to develop new technologies that they might know about about but wouldn't have necessarily seen a market for. This is all about harnessing those market forces, doing that on top of a base of our existing regulations where, in some situations you can really only get at a particular problem. For example, vehicle miles traveled. If you're going to try to deal with the carbon emissions that come from the way people use their cars today, you've got to help provide alternatives. You've got to do planning. You've got to work with your land use agencies. It would be way too complicated to try to put that into a cap-and-trade program. But for that, we have SB 375 with the sustainable community strategies. And, there are other examples of that. The renewable electricity standard is another one where you target it at a particular industry because you need to send a very specific message there. This enables us to get at a broader array of emissions and to do it in a way that we think will allow people to make the best investment decisions for their company while at the same time moving the whole economy forward in the right direction. You didn't ask this question, but I'm going to say that, it would be a better program if it were even larger. I mean, we would love to have more states. We would love to have a national program, and we believe that at some point that will happen. But we think that by the work that we're doing here in California, designing it in a way so that it benefits our state and has, careful provisions to make sure that we're not hurting our state competitively, but actually helping our state competitively, that we can help establish the ground rules to make sure that when the country is ready to move forward, we have a model here that others can use and that our leadership will be rewarded.
Well, ideally, when businesses are left with ample enough time to come up with new innovations, it's amazing what California's able to do, whether it's in the area of energy efficiency, which we find out actually saves businesses and others money in the long run. And there's success story after success story where the R&D and innovation that comes from here is used in other states and other countries around the world. So hopefully we're sending those right market signals for that new investment coming to California. Senator Keogh, you had a question, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to you, Madam Chair. We appreciate your leadership in this area so much. Yeah. At the very top of your remarks, you mentioned a settlement involving the PUC that's going to allow California to invest in lots of plug-in charging stations, I believe. Can you give me a little more information on that?
Sure.
Who are the parties to the settlement, and who's going to administer the money?
Right. I can claim no credit for this whatsoever, but I think as a passionate advocate for electric vehicles and a founding member of the Plug-in Vehicle Collaborative, I'm very excited about this. This is a legal settlement between the Public Utilities Commission, which sued, and the company NRG, which is the successor to Dynergy, which is one of the companies that we believe made illegal profits during the 2000-2001 energy crisis on selling electricity to the state of California that the state had to purchase through the PUC, of the IOUs, actually, for the benefit of the IOUs. And so they are the parties to the settlement. The details of how the money will be spent were worked out in that legal settlement. And my understanding is that it's very specific about where and how charging stations will be built and the limited time period that the company has to have a franchise to operate those stations. A great deal of thought and care went into making sure that the state as a whole would benefit and that this didn't become a license for this particular company to then take over the business of charging in California, which is something that we want to be opened up to a more competitive market. But the stations themselves will be public stations. They'll be actually placed in areas where the state already has developed the plans for where we need the first public stations to go. And then there's a whole, I forget the numbers now, but basically connections for stations that are going to be put into new construction around the state so that as we begin to build new commercial and multi-family residential facilities, they'll have the the ability to put in charging stations from the very outset. And this is going to give a huge jump start to the electric vehicle market, because we now know that the major concern on the part of buyers is whether they'll be too limited in the range or in the ability to use their vehicles.
Range anxiety is a new California malady.
Right.
So we think that's important too. Thank you for that update, because I got an email about that today, and so I wanted to know a little.
Well, I'm sure that you could get the PUC to come over and give you a full briefing, and they'd be happy to.
Can I ask about the other statements now, or do you want to go down?
Did you want to ask her one additional question before I went to Senator Harmon? Is that what you're asking? Senator Harmon?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I did have a question or two. I wanted to start out with the Sinclair paint doctrine and the requirement by the courts that there needs to be some sort of relationship between the revenue that's received to the regulatory cost. And I'm hearing that the revenues that may be generated under AB 32 may be in the billions of dollars range. How do you relate that cost to the regulatory cost?
Senator, I'm not going to try to give you a legal ruling on this issue, but I will explain what my understanding is. My understanding here is that in terms of the cost of actually implementing the regulation, that is what the Air Resources Board does when we administer the program, there is a fee already in AB 32. It's part of the original language of AB 32, and we've been collecting that fee for a couple of years now and using it both to pay back the original loans that came out of the beverage container fund to start this program, and then to begin paying for the ARB's costs in running the program. So that part of it is covered. Our understanding is that the funds that are generated through the auction will need to be spent in ways that support the purposes of AB 32 and that benefit the program as a whole. So there would have to be a nexus between any program expenditures and reduction in greenhouse gases. Beyond that, we are given the advice by our lawyers that we need to look at specific programs and issues and not sort of give generic advice about what could be in or what could be out. But I think the governor's budget, the language that was in the A pages and in the bill itself, represent the best thinking on the part of the administration about the purposes for which this money could be used.
Has the board come up with any projected costs that AB 32 will cost businesses and industry in California?
Well, if you look at the...
I keep hearing this number is going to cost billions with an S on it. Is that something that you concur with?
It depends. It completely depends on the price of the allowances. So,
have you done any studies or
yes,
projections?
Oh, yes, yeah. We have projections.
And what do those tell you?
High, medium, and low levels of projections that indicate revenues or value from these allowances that range from about $500 million or $500 million up to in the years after we bring fuels under this cap in 2015 on the order of somewhere between $4 and $6 billion over the life of the program. The program ends in 2020, so I mean the regulation ends in 2020.
And then this business about California kind of going alone. You mentioned that Quebec, the province of Quebec in Canada, has indicated a desire to be in partnership, or maybe they already have.
No, it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, but you're optimistic that it might occur. Well, you know, if Quebec, which is, help me with my geography, 1,000 miles or more away from us. What about our neighboring states here in the western United States? None of them have decided to go down the road that AB 32 in California are going down. And why is that? It seems to me that Californians and California businesses are the ones that are going to have to pay the lion's share of implementing this program. Why are the other states neighboring states, and take the general western United States. Why are they not participating, in your opinion?
I think it varies from state to state, Senator Harmon. With the states that are in the Pacific West, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, we've been working very closely through something called the Pacific Coast Collaborative on a number of initiatives relating to electric vehicles, renewable energy, building efficiency standards, and so forth, to try to come up with some common programs where we will all have stronger economic basis as a result of doing those things. But when it comes to using the word climate, I think the politics of that issue have gotten to be very divisive right now. And after the last election, there were a number of states that had been actively participating where their new governors said, we don't want any part of this cap and trade. We're not interested in being a part of it. And frankly, I believe that became a political issue, and it simply wasn't possible for those states to move forward on this portion of the program. But all of the states that are part of the Western Governors Association, regardless of party that's in control of their governor's office and legislature, have been participating in some of the discussions on the future of their clean technology, renewable energy programs. I think it's fallen to California as the largest economy in the western United States, and one of the largest economies in the world, for that matter, to play the leadership role in this issue. I think one of the reasons for that, frankly, is that we're by far the largest energy consumer, and our energy generation mix is not actually cleaner than that of the country as a whole. It will be when we're finished with all of our efforts to bring on more renewables, but right now, with all the coal that we import from other parts of the West, we are a huge generator of emissions. So it's our task, if you will, just as it was with automobiles, to work out the details of this kind of a program in a way that we think we can show is of benefit to us. I think you'll be hearing from Reggie from the eastern United States about what they did with their power sector that enabled them to start a program for auctioning allowances based on emissions, and how they invested that money in a way that was beneficial to their economies. So different states just get to these positions at different times. That's one of the good things about being a state.
Senator Harmon, one of the speakers in the second panel, is coming from the Massachusetts area, where the 10 states have collaborated together for the last 3 years in a row in a cap and trade program for the utility sector. And those questions you're asking should be asked to him.
We'll just defer on that one. One final question, if I could, Madam Chair, and it deals with the legal authority of the board, of which you're the chairman, to assess these billions of dollars of fees or taxes, whichever you want to call them. Have there been legal lawsuits and legal opinions verifying that the board, in fact, has the authority to do this? When I read AB 32, the thing that bothers me is it seems to me that the legislature should be deciding and assessing what these amounts will be. They did that in the Sinclair paint legislation. They capped it at, I think, $16 million, something like that. But it hasn't been done in this AB 32 exercise. And I'm just wondering, have there been lawsuits challenging the validity and of the board to questioning the process that they're using? And do you, if not, do you anticipate once the fees are levied that there will be lawsuits? And what do you project will be the results of those lawsuits? Multiple type question. I'm sorry for that format. Do the best you can.
I was actually thinking whether I dare to say that you should bite your tongue when you talk about those lawsuits, but we are expecting there will be lawsuits. I think it's sort of inevitable. I wish it weren't the case, but there's really nothing that we've done, in recent years where we've moved forward on our air quality program where somebody hasn't seen fit to sue, either from the left or from the right, challenging some aspect of the program. One of the features of our system is that anybody can bring a lawsuit. The question is, as they told me in law school, the question isn't can you bring the lawsuit, the question is are you going to win, and if you do win, what are you going to accomplish? Well, in this instance, we have looked at the text of AB 32, and we've consulted with our lawyers. They believe that the language that gave a great deal of discretion to the Air Resources Board to design this program and specifically mentioned that we could adopt a market-based program, we think gives us the authority. We clearly recognize that it did not give us the authority to spend the money. If we do an auction, the money has to be deposited with the state, and it can only be appropriated by the legislature. So we are going to be partners in this venture going forward no matter what. But we do believe that we have the authority to design and implement the auction. But as you've indicated, it's very likely that that will be tested by somebody, and then we'll just have to decide exactly based on what the courts tell us what we need to do. Thank you.
I would just like to make a comment, Senator Harmon, just as the author of the bill on the legislative intent on page 10, and we have little green booklets. It talks about, specifically, it says the state board may, referring to CARB, may adopt a regulation that establishes a system of market-based declining annual aggregate emission limits for sources or categories of sources that emit greenhouse gas emissions. And it goes on to talk about that they should be technologically feasible, et cetera. And so we had long, extensive negotiations with the administration on talking about different market-based mechanisms, auctioning of allowances, talking about offsets and all the different kinds of policies that go with it. And the language is very carefully put in to provide them the authority, and it didn't say shall, it said may, because we wanted them to be very thoughtful in how they went about it and see what makes the most sense. And so that was discussed in depth during the final months in the passage of AB 32. Senator Keel, you had one more question?
I'll take that hint. And I actually have several more, but I know there's going to be a lot of discussion. So we've already talked a little bit about allowances for best practices, and I'll ask you to expand on that a little bit, Ms. Nichols, rather than asking you about who our other trading partners are going to be eventually, like the Northeast folks, which they're going to be in the second panel. Right. So for California businesses that are already here in state, employing Californians and being part of our vibrant and growing economy, how are we going to kind of reward them for the steps they've taken to reduce emissions and improve efficiencies already once we pull the trigger on the auctions and the allowances?
Well, just to go back to the functioning of the cap and trade piece of this program, because in other areas there may be different incentives for people to do the right thing by becoming more efficient. But in the case of the cap and trade program, basically within any given sector, a company that uses less carbon per unit of output has a benefit already because they are more competitive. They will not need as many of these allowances, and in fact they may be in a position to sell allowances to their competitors through the open market because of their previous investments in efficiency. So really that is the main way that companies are going to be rewarded. I'm sorry.
And I have a concern about there are good companies that are, being efficient to the bone for economic reasons and lots of reasons. And yet they still have concerns about emissions here in California and what the cap and trade program might do to their business going forward. And you came down and visited San Diego, and I know there's other parts around the state. Right. What can we, specifically say to them, to encourage them to continue to do business here?
Sure. I think probably the major thing that we've tried to build into this rule to make sure that we are not losing our competitive edge is that we didn't give away all the allowances for free. We've held back a portion of the allowances specifically to be used in cases where we're facing the possibility of what they call leakage,
yeah.
which really means losing businesses. It's sort of a horrible term. Or where a company faces pressures that they're not able to adapt to because of circumstances beyond their control, or for some of the sectors that are subject to the cap-and-trade program where they may not have the ability to raise revenues or raise prices. For example, one of my favorite candidates for some relief in terms of getting additional free allowances out of this pool that we're holding back is the University of California, which has a couple of old and not very efficient power plants that were built back in the day when it looked like a really good idea to have their own facilities, but now these are not very efficient contracts, or very good contracts, and it's going to take a little while to get out of them. So if we're allowed, and this will have to go back through approval from the legislature, and if we use revenue from the system to do this, but we would actually be able to help them write down the cost of getting out of some of these old contracts and getting into something that would be more efficient and without penalizing the universities, which I think are under enough stress as it is. So that's just an example maybe of how this could work. So we will be using allowances, a direct allocation of allowances, and we will also be coming to you with a plan for using revenue from the allowances that the state will be auctioning. And one of the chief concerns that we have is making sure that there's not undue impacts on any category of customers within the state. I know the business that you're talking about is a customer of one of the companies that's regulated by the PUC, and this issue of how they will be able to be compensated through the program is one of the issues that is exactly before the PUC in this proceeding.
Thank you. I think this is such an exciting undertaking,
Yeah.
complicated as it is,
Right.
and as many questions as there are from the private sector and the citizenry. I think that this is an example of where California can get out in front of an important issue that is a long-term growth issue for us.
Yes.
Every time I open up a business page, I see that venture capital and investment in clean tech is we're the leader. We're the leader many times. A month ago, Ernst & Young let out a report that said California continues to lead national clean tech investment with $2.8 billion raised in 1 year in 2011. In the fourth quarter, California was the target of 67% of the national investment, followed by Massachusetts and Colorado. So we often hear that, this might be a drag on the economy. I think quite the opposite. These are big numbers, but nothing like the size of our whole economy. But still, it's a driver. In San Diego, it's the tech sector that is coming out of the recession first. Silicon Valley is coming out first. So we need to make sure that we are still being innovative in capturing this very competitive dollars here in California. I think cap and trade is a part of that, and I think it's very important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for your presentation and your consistently excellent work.
Thank you.
I know we have a lot at stake, and I know we'll work very hard to get this right. I wanted to thank also Assemblymember Dickerson for coming, because one of the challenges in this term-limited environment that Senator Harman, myself, and Senator Kehoe were all here in 2000, so 2001, and part of the discussion with the car bill and everything else is the institutional memory. And if there's any other members that weren't around for the discussion, if AB 32. They're still in the building. They may want to join us.
Wander in.
I'm just going to piggyback on real briefly what Senator Kehoe said, and I'm glad she talked about some of the positive aspects. But it's really important that we continue to provide legislative oversight, expenditures of monies, setting the priorities, working through the budget process, listening to our business partners and, who are all up and down the state. But just last night in particular, I was talking to several people, and there were people involved in different renewable energy and clean tech kind of business, and they said the reason they're here is because of the policies created in California, sending that market signal. So, for example, Bloom Energy said
Yes.
they're here. In 2002, they had 8 employees. They have over 1,000 today, and that's in fuel cells and other kinds of technologies. And it's manufacturing based, and it's right here.
Yes.
Then someone had to top that. Someone next to her who was representing, I believe it was Solar City, talked about a couple of dozen employees, and now it's way over 1,000 and here. But there's story after story, but of some really good news stories in creating new jobs for this new economy. So one of the challenges we have, because we are the home of getting the most venture capitalist money because of our policies, is taking the R&D that's provided here and working very hard to have the ongoing sustainable business and the jobs that come with it, and not sending the R&D to other countries, but manufacturing jobs created right here, along with the employment training that comes with it as we transition in this new economy. So thank you very much on behalf of the legislature for your work, and have
Pleasure
a
to be
good rest
here.
of the evening.
Okay.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
So we have our next panel coming up, and they will sort of be able to answer more on a specific sense some of the questions that were asked of Ms. Nichols. And let me introduce them as the three of them come forward on panel 2. Dallas Bertraw, he's a senior fellow at Resources for the Future and one of the nation's foremost experts on environmental regulation, great background in the National Academy of Sciences and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And in the middle is Kara Horowitz. She's a professor of law at UCLA and has done a lot of legal work in conjunction with AB 32 and specifically the Cap and Trade program, and is the executive director of the Emmett Center on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA. It's part of the UCLA Law School there. And the last speaker is Paul Hubbard. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but he'll correct me. He's vice president of the Analyst Group. Analyst Group is an economic and financial consulting firm. They measure the economic impacts of the first 3 years of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That's called RGGI, the acronym, the 10 northeastern states. They've been looking at this for 3 years. He's going to talk a little bit about what happened to their electric rates. Did it negatively or positively affect job growth? How did the allowances work? So there's a model out there, but it is different. They're a utility sector program, and we're multi-sector, but it's still helpful information in that there's other models that we can look at for success stories. So Dallas, why don't you start off, and appreciate you coming, and you're going to talk a little bit about the program design.
Senator, because of the heat and noise of this machine, can I stand at the podium?
You may, and that's actually better. Do we need that on? Yes, you do.
Yeah, we do.
I can see your name. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me today. I work at Resources. I'm an economist at Resources for the Future, a 60-year-old institution in Washington, D.C. that does non-advocacy, nonpartisan work, and all our work is in the public domain. I emphasize that these comments are my own opinions and not those of my employer. Now, before launching into what is sometimes a dreary topic of cap and trade, I have a pledge to myself to pause for a moment and remind ourselves why we're having this conversation. So I want to take just a second to show you this striking slide. This represents a storm in October 2010, which was the largest land-based storm ever observed in North America, with the structure of a cyclone centered over Chicago. It was dubbed the Chi-clone. It shattered all previous barometric pressure records and caused severe wind damage in the upper plains. And this picture in and of itself proves nothing. It is simply evidence consistent with the idea that we may be experiencing a changing climate. This picture reminds us of the exceptional heat patterns in the summer of 2011, where most of the country experienced temperatures that were well above average. What really strikes you here, though, is that two states, Texas and Oklahoma, suffered the hottest months that any state had ever suffered in history. And also, I think this picture brings home the fact that although climate change is a global problem, its effects are felt locally. And so consequently, it's natural that we see local responses begin to emerge to try to deal with the climate problem. And one of those is SB 1368, passed some years ago, that required a natural gas combined cycle of emission rate standard for all long-term power contracts in the state. And if you don't know yet, today, the US EPA uplifted that California standard to the new first-ever national greenhouse gas standard for steam-fired power plants in the United States, essentially adopting the same model as the California legislation. So congratulations. But we want to focus on AB 32, and Mary already went through how this shows, the top bar shows 1990 emissions, and then there's business as usual 2020 forecasts, and then where the reductions are coming from. Most of the reductions from California will come from regulatory measures, and that's what's shown in that circled portion. Cap and trade comes along to clean up the rest, and what I call it the program to make sure that we leave no low-cost emission reductions behind. It does this by putting an overall cap in place and then allow trading to occur. And that trading and the scarcity of the allowances introduces a price and provides an incentive for firms to find ways to reduce emissions even if they haven't been specifically identified by regulation. Previously, all other types of regulation allowed firms that complied with regulation to go on and pollute for free. What cap and trade does is put the price on the ability to pollute. Now, the California program, I'll say, after having studied programs around the world, the California program has learned a great deal from previous programs, and I will offer the summary statement that the California program is the best designed program that has emerged anywhere in the world up to this point in time. And there's three features that deserve attention in this regard, I think. One of them is cost management. Cost management addresses the question of price volatility or the possibility that prices could move out of the range of expectation, and it has been a somewhat important problem in previous programs. The provisions of the cap and trade program in California, including banking, which allows firms to sort of self-insure by building up a stock of allowances for use in future years. The possibility for offsets, which will bring new allowances into the market if the price rises. The presence of the price collar, which puts a price floor and a price ceiling in place, and then the ARB has put in place mechanisms to enforce that price collar. These things provide strong support for managing costs of the program and keeping those costs in line with what our expectations expect. And then also coming along will be linkage, hopefully, with Quebec and other provinces, which will broaden the program. The second feature is the role for auctions. And I served a couple years ago on the Economic and Allocation Advisory Committee to the Air Resources Board, which provided recommendations to the board on the design of the program. And one of the central recommendations there was to rely to the maximum extent possible on auctions to initially distribute those emission allowances. Why? Why use auctions? Well, first of all, auctions are very useful in protecting against one of the major problems with some previous cap and trade programs, which is windfall profits. That is, that firms have the opportunity to pass through price changes and charge consumers for something that they receive for free if you give those emission allowances away for free. Secondly, it's effective at guarding against the slight possibility, in my mind, of market manipulation. And third, it penetrates the corporate culture that seems to think that free allocation is a license for business as usual. But when they have to buy allowances in an auction, that changes the culture within the firms. Thirdly, what to do with the revenues. This is the third feature of the program that deserves attention, and I call this California's new gold. The committee that I mentioned offered 4 conceptual ways that this allowance value could be used. One was to contribute to the general fund and reduce marginal tax rates, but the Sinclair case seems to offer reasons for why that cannot be accomplished, and Kara is going to speak about that in just a moment. Second is to make program-related investments in energy efficiency and other measures that will help reduce the cost of achieving these goals, and that's been very successfully done in the Northeast states, and Paul is going to talk about that in just a moment. The third was strategic allocation to prevent leakage. The committee reasoned that it made no sense to basically allow emissions to remain constant and a bunch of jobs to leave the state in response to a program that was put in place in California and not put in place in neighboring states. And in economics, there's a strategic way to deal with this, and it is through making allocation for free based on economic activity that goes on in the state. So if a firm reduces its economic activity, it loses its allocation, but if it maintains its economic activity, it gets these allowances for free. And the committee endorsed this idea, but recommended strongly that this be kept small and that be rigorously administered by the ARB. And then the fourth conceptual option was to return this allowance value directly back to households, with the reasoning being that the atmosphere is a common property resource and that individuals own that common property resource, and direct payments back to households could be viewed as compensation for harm to the environment or payment for environmental services. And this obviously would be politically very attractive if to give allowances right back to households. It could amount as much as $250 per person in the year 2020 if all the allowances were spent in this way. Well, the ARB has made a series of decisions that are very practical in nature and not just conceptual. And this my last slide illustrates the three main avenues for which allowance value is flowing into the program. At the bottom, the green portion represents the free allocation that's going to investor-owned utilities and should be returned to the benefit of electricity ratepayers. The main question before the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, that you may want to pay attention to is whether that allowance value should go back to households and other electricity consumers on a volumetric basis, essentially on bill, reducing the increase in prices that otherwise would occur so that households and other customers basically see no change in their electricity bill. Or should that electricity bill price be allowed to change and then have the payments go back to households in a separate envelope off bill maybe at the end of the year. The second bar there represents the free allocation, most of that going to industry to address the question of leakage, which I mentioned. And then the top portion, the blue portion, is that portion which starts small and then gets big in 2015 because it comes primarily from the introduction of natural gas and transportation fuels to the program. And this money is slated to go into the Pollution Control Fund. The governor's proposed budget identifies about $1 billion could be raised in 2012 and 2013 auctions. There are 4 auctions for allowances that are going to enter the program 3 years later. And this money would be allocated in that proposal to reimburse for costs already incurred, to put AB 32 in place and related programs, and for new programs that might be related to AB 32. So to summarize, to date, I think the decisions in the program design have been really, truly excellent. It's not first best, but California does not operate in a first best environment. California operates in an open economy surrounded by neighboring states who haven't gone as far as California has to this point in time to take responsibility for their greenhouse gas emissions. So in a second best world, these decisions have been really excellent. My concern, and I think what should be of interest to the legislature, is the future. Beginning in 2015, when the Pollution Control Fund could grow, according to our estimates about what the cost of allowances would be, to be as much or greater than $6 billion per year. Will there be sufficient, I ask, I'm not asserting it, this is not a rhetorical question, but I ask, will there be sufficient cost-effective investments to go forward, that we can identify to go forward that will be in the interest of consumers who are actually fundamentally footing the bill for this program? And who will look out for consumers? I think that is what is an issue in the long run what the legislature should want to pay attention to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if members don't mind, I'm going to have all three talk for 5 or 8 minutes, and then we'll have a round of questions to whoever you'd like to follow up with. Next up, we have Kara Horowitz. She'll talk a little bit about legal and regulatory issues associated with AB 32's cap and trade programs.
Thank you, Senator Pavley and members of the committee. As Senator Pavley said, I'm Kara Horowitz. I'm on the faculty at the UCLA School of Law. I'm the executive director there of the Emmett Center on Climate Change and the Environment. And we do academic, nonpartisan analysis of climate law and policy. I'm here today to report on 2 studies I've undertaken with some of my colleagues at UCLA Law and elsewhere on 2 aspects of California's cap-and-trade program relevant to today's hearing. The first is market enforcement, and the second is the use of proceeds from the auction, which has already been a topic of interest at today's hearing. Our first study assesses the potential for market manipulation and gaming in California's, in California's cap-and-trade program design. If anybody has some water, I would love some. Sorry. For this analysis, we partnered with Bowman Cutter of Pomona College and examined CARB's program design, drawing from both literature and allowance trading and from real-world lessons that had been taught by experiences in other programs. And I believe that each of you has received a copy of this report. It's called Rules of the Game. In general, my colleagues and I concluded that CARB has designed a program that incorporates the best practices and lessons learned from other allowance trading programs. And we think it's unlikely, thank you so much, that CARB will experience market manipulation significant enough to affect efficiency or fairness, or to cause unwarranted price volatility. So Dr. Bertraw has already addressed many of these same questions about program design, and I won't go into more detail on our views on those questions because we share his view that the program is strong. I will say a little bit more about enforcement authority because Dr. Bertraw did not address that question. CARB has designed a robust system of monitoring and enforcement that, in our view, should allow it to detect foul play and impose adequate penalties to deter noncompliance.
Got some slides.
I do, just a couple.
Okay, fine.
All right.
Take it off.
It's
not hers now.
okay. Its bases for asserting jurisdiction over program participants are strong, and available penalties include significant fines as well as criminal liabilities. So once again, we concluded that CARB had done a good job in its program design with respect to enforcement. Moving on to my second topic, I'll address the legal constraints on spending California's cap-and-trade auction proceeds. We're releasing a paper later this week on this topic, and here are our main conclusions. First, on statutory constraints. While AB 32 authorizes the use of market mechanisms, as Senator Pavley pointed out, for achieving greenhouse gas reductions, it does not dictate how to spend auction proceeds. The statute does limit the use of other fees. Section 38597 of AB 32 authorizes ARB to adopt a schedule of fees to be paid by regulated businesses and requires that those revenues be made available for purposes of carrying out AB 32. We conclude that this fee schedule provision likely does not affect the use of auction proceeds for the following reasons. It is explicitly limited to the use of revenues collected pursuant to that section of AB 32. Not revenues that result from other AB 32 programs, such as, for example, a market-based mechanism for controlling emissions. Nothing in the statute suggests to us that the legislature intended its grant of additional authority to enact fees to implement AB 32 to wind up constraining CARB's separately granted authority to enact a market-based mechanism. We also looked at constitutional constraints on revenue use, and those are the ones that have already been brought up a couple of times in today's hearing, the Sinclair paint question. AB 32, as you know, passed California legislature with a majority vote, but not with a two-thirds supermajority, which means it cannot have enacted a tax. The state may, however, impose charges on some businesses to offset the environmental impacts of those businesses, and such regulatory fees can be passed with a simple majority vote, but then the use of those regulatory fees is restricted. The main California Supreme Court case distinguishing between regulatory fees and taxes is known as Sinclair paint, and Senator Harman has already raised this case. If AB 32's cap-and-trade program is challenged in court as an illegal tax, questions about the reach of Sinclair paint will be ones of first impression. The AB 32 cap-and-trade program and auctions are novel, and California courts have not been called on before to try and classify anything like this under the Sinclair paint regime. Nevertheless, it's arguable that the cap-and-trade program imposes something akin to a regulatory fee in that it raises state money as part of a program directed at controlling pollution. To minimize its legal vulnerability, therefore, the state should consider its revenue allocation decisions in light of the Sinclair paint regime, keeping in mind the spectrum of risk associated with different proceed allocation choices. So which revenue allocation decisions are riskiest under a Sinclair Paint analysis? The sort of $1 billion question. Strategic pause. Under Sinclair, the state should be able to show that regulatory fees have not been, quote, used for unrelated revenue purposes, unquote. As recently summarized by the Supreme Court, an excessive fee that is used to generate general revenue becomes a tax. So here, that likely means restricting revenue use to programs that further AB 32's goals. We discern three potential sets of AB 32 goals relevant here. First is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions to achieve the statute's 2020 state limit is unquestionably central to AB 32, and using auction proceeds to help achieve direct reductions in greenhouse gas emissions is the safest way to show that revenues are not being used for unrelated revenue purposes. The second set of goals is the advancement of other aims that have been set by the legislature in AB 32. The legislature gave CARB significant discretion to figure out how to reduce the state's climate emissions, but also urged the agency to consider and prioritize a set of additional goals along the way. The most relevant of these goals direct CARB to the extent feasible, and in furtherance of achieving the statewide greenhouse gas emissions limit, to ensure, for example, that activities do not disproportionately impact low-income communities, to design market-based compliance mechanisms to prevent any increase in the emission of toxic air contaminants or criteria air pollutants, to direct investment toward the most disadvantaged communities in California to minimize leakage, and to do a series of several other things that are listed in full in my submitted testimony. Though these goals were enumerated by the legislature, they cannot be considered to be of the same order of priority as reducing greenhouse gases. The safest revenue expenditure plan would mirror the bill's priorities, using emissions reductions as a threshold directive and prioritizing revenue uses based on their ability to accomplish other AB 32 goals. The third set of goals is the reduction of climate change impacts on California through adaptation projects. AB 32 does not state a goal focused on mitigating the harms of climate change, apart from its calls for reducing greenhouse gas emissions or for achieving the other specific goals stated in the statute and just discussed. We therefore conclude it would be somewhat risky to use auction proceeds to help the state adapt to climate change, but in ways that don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions or serve one of the other explicit goals of the statute. To advance adaptation, a less risky approach would be to fund projects that result in both greenhouse gas emission reductions and adaptation benefits, and there are many such programs. So, needless to say, the most risky approach to allocating proceeds from the auction would be to support programs that are unrelated to any of these three sets of AB 32 goals, such as, for example, general fund relief. So in summary, we conclude that the legislature should consider these main four questions as it determines how risky any given use of auction proceeds might be under a Sinclair Paint analysis. First, will the project permanently, verifiably reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Second, will the project advance other explicit AB 32 goals, such as the ones I discussed, including investments in disadvantaged communities? Third, has the state built a strong record showing how the revenue use will achieve the purposes of AB 32? And fourth, does the project avoid direct allocation of money for revenue purposes unrelated to AB 32? And the more of these questions you can answer yes to, the safer your allocation plan is under Sinclair Paint. And finally, I want to emphasize the limits of this analysis. To say that a particular proposal may be risky under Sinclair is not to say necessarily that it shouldn't be adopted. Instead, decision makers should understand and consider the risks of its being held invalid by the courts when weighing their options. Thanks so much again for your time and attention, and I look forward to questions at the end if you have them.
Thank you very much, Kara. And last but not least, Paul Hibbard, welcome from the analysis group. He's vice president there, and he's going to talk about direct economic impacts as associated with the 3-year study of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative from the 10 northeastern states.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to come out here from the East Coast and present to you today. I am, as Senator Popoli mentioned, I'm with Analysis Group, which is an economic and financial consulting firm with offices across the United States. That we have offices in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Menlo Park. But as will become very clear, the more I talk, I'm based in our offices in Boston, Massachusetts. And
I hear some R issues already.
yeah, well, you'll hear more, I'm sure. There are prior to joining Analysis Group, I was the chairman of the Public Utility Commission in Massachusetts from 2007 to 2010. At a time when Massachusetts underwent a very significant change in energy policy and has adopted many of the clean tech-oriented policies that have been adopted in California. Earlier in my career, I worked in both the Public Utility Commission when we were restructuring the electric industry and in the Environmental Protection Division when we first started implementing controls on carbon dioxide for power plants in the state. I'm here to report on the results of an economic analysis that I did with colleagues at Analysis Group on the first 3 years of implementation of the cap-and-trade program in the Northeast U.S. that was implemented beginning in 2009. The RGGI program, as it's called, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, covers 10 states, all of the New England states, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. The RGGI was the result of several years of deliberation, beginning with an administration-level commitment, governor-level commitment across all the states, beginning in 2005, with the states ultimately agreeing on 3 major elements. Number 1, to cap emissions from the power sector. The RGGI program began with an MOU that allows for a cap-and-trade program covering other sectors within the region, but initially the program began with a cap-and-trade program focused on just the power sector. Number 2, to auction virtually all of the allowances. That was one of the key goals of the RGGI states. And third, to use the auction revenues in a manner that was left to the discretion of the individual states, but subject only to the express goal that the funds be used for public policy purposes. And the analysis, the economic analysis we did of the first 3 years of program implementation found that each of these decisions played a critical role in determining what the impact on the economy was of the cap-and-trade program in that region. So our analysis is a snapshot of that first compliance period. It's based on real data. It's based on actual implementation and actual use of funds in that region. We explicitly did not try to assess the program going forward, try to project how it should be implemented. We didn't try to assess human health, environmental, or climate risk mitigation benefits of the program. We simply followed the money. We looked at the actual dollars that were collected under the program. In the first 3 years, we tracked how the money was spent by states, followed the flow of dollars through the state agencies and out into program implementation and what the outcomes of those programs were, and how that affected wholesale electricity markets and the economies in the RGGI states. And we measured the resulting economic impacts and quantified them in the report. So what did we find? The key results are summarized on page 9 of the presentation that was included in your packet, but they're also listed here on the slide. Over the first compliance period, the states collected approximately $1 billion in proceeds through the auction of allowances and spent the money in a wide variety of ways with the following economic outcomes. The program produces roughly $1.6 billion in net economic value added across the region, and that's a positive economic impact in every one of the 10 states. Customers initially experienced wholesale power cost increases of approximately, on average, less than 1%, about 0.7% in those first 3 years associated with the program. But over time, we'll save over $1 billion in avoided electricity costs and another $170 million in avoided payments for fossil fuels for heating in the region. These savings derive primarily from the fact that the reinvestment of auction proceeds by the states largely went to energy efficiency programs that produce these savings over time, reducing customer bills who participate in the program, but also reducing the wholesale price of power in the region, benefiting all consumers. RGGI spending leads to the creation of 16,000 net additional jobs within the region. And since the Northeast has very little in the way of indigenous fuel sources, we virtually import all of the fuels that we need for electricity generation in the region. By reducing our consumption of electricity and heating fuels, we end up keeping in the region an additional $770 million that otherwise would go to fossil fuel producers outside of the region, and it's kept for local economic benefit. Power plant owners actually initially benefit from the program because as they factor in the price of the allowances into wholesale markets, all power plant owners are getting additional revenues associated with the higher price of electricity. But as the energy efficiency programs take hold over time, it rather dramatically decreases the quantity of electricity consumed, and over time, power plant owners recover $1.6 billion in lower $1.6 billion in lower revenues over the modeling period. So in short, the first 3 years of program implementation of the first cap and trade program in the country generated economic growth in every one of the 10 states that participated, then greater economic growth than would have occurred absent the program. So there are several key takeaways from our analysis that I want to highlight here, and then certainly we'll be willing to answer questions if you have questions about the detail that's in the report. These takeaways are important because while they are particular to the RGGI region, which isn't the same, the RGGI program isn't necessarily the same type of program as you're implementing here, but there are very strong similarities with respect to each of these elements that I want to highlight. The program was fundamentally rooted in states' rights. States were free to give away all their allowances, to sell some portion of the allowances, or to auction the allowances in any way and in any number they saw fit, and to use the revenues generated in accordance whatever their individual state public policy goals were. But in the end, the economic value of the program flows mainly from two extremely important decisions that all of the RGGI states made. Number one, every state chose to auction virtually all of its allowances. And there was an administrative entity created very similar to the entity you're creating for the purposes of taking the allowances and actually conducting the auctions, dispersing the money to the states. And that's called RGGI Inc. They're essentially an administrative function that goes through this process, gets the money back to the states, and then monitors the program over time. And by doing so, all of the states retained the value of the allowances for public policy purposes. In our regions, they're wholesale markets, whereas Dr. Bertrauer was mentioning, regardless of whether or not the allowances are given to the electricity generators or they're auctioned and the generators have to purchase them, they factor in the same price in their bids for selling electricity in the region. So it doesn't, whether they're given the allowances for free or they have to purchase them, it has the same exact price effect on consumers. And so by keeping the revenues for the states and using the revenues for public policy purposes, the states made a very key decision. Second, while the states invested the money in a variety of ways, and how the states spent the money is identified on slide 8 in the presentation and presented in more detail in our report, nearly all of the spending of the money was tied to public policy programs. And most importantly, the vast majority of the spending went back into the electricity sector for energy efficiency programs. And this helped centralize a large portion of the economic benefits within the electric sector. It dramatically mitigated the cost of the program on electricity consumers and had a major effect on the economic impacts of program implementation. The reason efficiency, of course, is such a strong element to this is because it benefits the economy in two ways. First, by spending on the programs where contractors are going out to houses and installing efficiency measures, but also consumers save money and that money gets reinvested in the economy, so you get a double whammy there. It's important to note in this respect, though, that we only looked at quantifiable economic benefits in our analysis. And in that context, energy efficiency stands out, but states spent the money in a wide variety of ways. In our report, we document almost 150 different ways in which the states actually used auction proceeds. And we conducted detailed studies on about a dozen of those. And what becomes clear is that a number of very important public policy objectives that were different across the different states that participated, are met in the different ways that the states use the money. And not all the benefits and impacts are able to be quantified in an economic sense or otherwise. Some other key examples of the way the states use the money were direct bill assistance for low-income customers, direct investments in renewable or advanced energy projects, direct investment in wetlands restoration or greenhouse gas mitigation measures outside of the electric sector. There were some reserves taken for contribution to address state budget deficits and to avoid the cutting of programs that otherwise would have been cut. There were a number of education and training programs related to energy and climate issues that were funded by it, and there was a lot of money invested to support local communities and municipalities through giving them the opportunity to improve the efficiency of municipal buildings, schools, and other items, and to actually make investments in renewable energy within their communities.
Are you close to being
I
finished?
am.
Because I want to allow time
sentence.
for
Absolutely.
any questions, otherwise we'll be...
Sure. And in fact, I can just wrap up. The point is really that our economic analysis reveals economic benefits tied to the first 3 years of implementation of the cap-and-trade program, and it allowed states to use the revenues in a way that met a number of important public policy objectives. So again, thank you very much. Sorry for taking so long.
Thank you very much. No, it's just thank you for coming all this way and sharing information with you. Questions of any three of these speakers? All had different thoughts to share. Very productive discussion, I thought, as we heard from models in the northeastern states, a legal analysis and design challenges and opportunities that we face in California. Senator Harmon, did you have a question?
I think I'll pass. We're about out of time, aren't
We are about out of time. But I want to thank all three of you then for your very productive comments, and we have your statements here and reports, and there may be opportunities for us to follow up with you through Henry Stern or others if anyone has any questions of you. Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran.
With that, I wanted to just see if there was anyone in the audience that just had to say something for a minute or two, or would be more than happy to wait till some subsequent hearing or turn in your questions or comments in writing. You heard that auctions will not be held as originally planned in August. They've been postponed to November, but there'll be an active simulation. I think something you want to monitor very carefully. Want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who not only participated in this program, but who organized the program. So Henry Stern, thank you very much, and Meredith in our office. And is there anyone else to thank? That was it. And thank you very much for members staying after a very long day. Very important topic, and I think legislative oversight is going to be critically important to the success of this program. Have a good evening.
we? How are you?